been a bit of a struggly time lately, kids. Both in the micro with this particular episode and in the macro of life more generally. And there's been a temptation on my part to slide down the freaking rabbit hole on that, but I've been working with a notion, working with a question that I think is a much more positive, constructive, powerful way to confront these scenarios where it feels like stuff's just not working out for you, man. Hoping to give you something useful on what is admittedly a relatively short episode this week. Still, I think there's some value to be gained here, and we'll get to it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. So, what is life asking of you right now? That's a question that's been on my mind for a while, actually, as I'm trying to wrestle with some circumstances. And it comes to light today because I've been really struggling badly to come up with an episode this week. You know, I make it seem super easy. I make it seem seamless. You know, I play pickleball with, and every now and again, I watch somebody play pickleball who is just, they make it look so effortless, you know. Like I watch people and they have this fluidity in their shot making and this imagination, and it seems effortless, you know. I was about to repeat a phrase that an old weight room training partner of mine used to say, which is rather explicit. I will not use his language. I look like, please forgive me, people, a dog fornicating a football when I'm out there playing the pickleball. But, you know, I've seen other people who are so poetic and so fluid and so athletic in their motions. It's really something to see. And I know that it would appear that this podcast is produced and created the same way, with the same kind of fluidity, with the same kind of ease of motion, with, if you will, the same sort of verbal athleticism that I see sometimes on the pickleball court. It isn't. It's way more like that dog thing when I'm especially out there just trying to come up with something to talk about, something to say. One of the real drawbacks of a solo generalist podcast like this is that sometimes there just isn't a lot to say. And to be fair, I don't do much anymore. Again, as I've said before, when I started this show, it was back in the touring days, man, back in the music days, back in 2019, when I was living a much more interesting, I want to say, life, when I was out doing stuff more than I am doing stuff now. And so I struggle sometimes to come up with a podcast episode, and my default setting is to get very, very upset about that and to attack myself and to feel guilty and to really get into this kind of negative spiral about how my thinking isn't creative enough. I'm not curious enough. You know, I'm not good enough at doing this thing that I'm doing, whatever it is that I'm doing. And that is not a helpful state of mind. You know, for me, it's a default setting. It goes layers deep. It goes back to childhood. I have discussed, actually, just before I started recording this, I discussed the idea with my therapist, you know, and it opened up some layers. And this is one of the things that I think is so vital about therapy and why I think everybody should be in therapy, even if you are not unhappy, even if you are not struggling with anything. Therapy has this really wonderful way of exposing your layers, you know, and it can only be helpful to you to begin to understand why you do some of the things you do as a default setting, what some of your motivations are, what some of your protections are. And this discussion opened up some of that stuff for me to think about. I'm not going to sort through all of that in real time with you right now. But lately, I've had this question on my mind. What is life asking of you right now? And I find that that is a much more useful approach to situations more generally. Okay, now this issue with not having a podcast topic this week comes on the heels of a much wider, more objective view that I have been dealing with in terms of life in general these days, okay? Now, I recently interviewed for a job. A job. That's a Douglas Copeland reference for those of you who have read Generation X. I interviewed for a job for which I am qualified and for which I thought I was a pretty strong freaking candidate, man. And time has gone by. It would appear that that job is not going to come my way. And I've interviewed for others over the course of the past year and a half or so, as I have been endeavoring to go straight. I lived this kind of marauding, buccaneering life on the edge for a while, touring musician, artist in air quotes. And the pandemic really cut the legs off of that. And for me, it's been a struggle trying to find my way back again. You know, next weekend, I suppose this coming weekend, I have the privilege of playing a Christmas extravaganza with an artist called Julie Hobby. And she's wonderful, and I've not played with her before, but we've been working up a really kick-ass Christmas show, kids. And that's happening in L-Town on Sunday afternoon. Tickets available. And that will be my last show of the year. And when I look at the P's and Q's, when I tally it all up, I'll find that I'm operating at about 25% of the capacity I was operating at pre-pandemic. All right, I'm playing a quarter of the shows that I was playing before. And that leaves me in a position where this life is not sustainable, you know? And so I've been working at going straight. I've been working at getting back into the traditional workforce, and that's all well and good. You know, I am a very capable, very qualified, I am an asset to have in your organization. But for one reason or another, it's just not coming to me. And I've had to begin to understand that I'm the age I am. And I have the career profile that I have. You know, I took some chances, kids. I went out there over the past 10 years and I took some freaking chances. And I do not regret that for a second. And I had experiences and I have this life that I have that's utterly different than it was because of those chances. But here we are, you know, the episode I did a little while back, here we are. You know, you cannot change the past. You can only accept the past and realize that you're here now. And what are you going to do going forward? For me, that has been trying to go straight. That has been trying to get a more consistent income together. That has been a shift. And I have felt as though life is asking me to make a shift, you know, out of the sort of focus that I've had playing music, trying to live that life. It's asking me to make a shift into something perhaps more traditional, or at least something different. Not 100% sure what that is yet. And so a certain amount of frustration comes with that when I have so far been unable to land that traditional position that I've been seeking in the field in which I am most qualified, which is corporate communications / public relations. You know, that has not really worked out for me. Music, as I said, I'm operating at a quarter of what I did before. Now, part of that is me turning down some stuff. All right, I turned down a handful of gigs this year that I might have played because my relationship to music has changed since the pandemic. I've talked about this before too, but there's just certain stuff I'm not really interested in doing anymore. Being at a bar at 1 or 2 in the morning with a bunch of drunk people doesn't really appeal to me anymore. And once you begin to accept this notion that perhaps music is going to change in terms of my connection to it, you know, not necessarily trying to do the full-time thing anymore, whatever. It's like you become selective in those circumstances. Like, okay, if I'm not going to pursue this as a career anymore, and I may or I may not, it's like if I'm not going to do that, then what I do commit to has to have certain parameters, right? I'm still sorting out what those parameters are, but it's like my relationship to music is changing. And so that accounts, at least up to a point, for why I've played a quarter of the gigs that I would normally have played pre-pandemic. Now, it's not everything, and most of it comes down to the artists that I was working with have moved away or moved on or are doing different things, whatever. A lot of what I was doing before no longer exists, right? It's gone. And venues are gone. And a lot of artists who quit playing during the pandemic because they had to have not returned. You know, the scene is not what it was, right? The opportunities are not the same as they were. It does not mean that I won't get a phone call this afternoon that changes everything, but it's like I've had to accept my age, my location, the way things kind of are now. And I've also had to accept my changed feelings about how I want to interact with music. I'm no longer willing to play every dang gig that comes along for $75 because I need to make the money. It's like things have changed in my perception and in how I want to do things. And that is partly why I've played so many fewer shows, but it's not all of it. I mean, things have radically changed out there. And so I look at this situation where struggling to find a regular job, where music is not what it was. And so I've had to reframe and rethink about what that is now. I look at this podcast, and it's that time of year, by the way, kids. All right, the year is ending. For introspective types like me, we begin evaluating, right? We look back at the year and we're like, well, what happened? And what happened is I played a quarter of the shows. I did not land a regular job. This podcast has not done in terms of downloads, streams, attention growth, what I hoped it would. All right. These are the realities. And so I sit back and I'm like, okay, things are not really unfolding. Things are not flowing in the way that I would have liked. And so the temptation for me is to go down a rabbit hole and to look at it all and say, why am I not good enough? Why am I not curious enough to make a better podcast? Why am I not getting opportunities to do this? Why am I not landing? Like, it's like there's a temptation to go into this negative spiral that just pulls you down. And I've talked about some of this before, and I don't need to reiterate it here. There's a temptation to become depressed because nothing is working. And why is nothing working? But the thing is, you ask that question, why is nothing working, without actually asking the question, why is nothing working? Now, there are practical answers to that question. All right, music is not working because the scene doesn't exist anymore. All of the artists left and some of the other ones didn't come back. I mean, that's one possible answer to that question. Maybe it's not working because you're not hustling hard enough. You know, that's another answer to the question. It's not necessarily the answer in my case. It's perhaps an answer in your case. But when you ask, why is nothing working for me? Sometimes you're not asking that genuinely and really stopping to think about a different angle on the question. Why is nothing happening for me? Instead of looking at that as some sort of punishment or as some sort of lament or as some sort of self-indulgence, you stop back and you step back and you say, why is nothing happening for me? Like, is there a deeper message here? And that's why I asked the question, what is life asking of you right now? I have felt the need for change. I've talked before on the show about this sense of change happening, and I can see that on a practical level in the musical sense. Things have changed, all right? And my perception of things has changed as well, and that's all well and good. That's evolution, that's growth, that's whatever it is. It's fine. I'm just recognizing that as an objective fact. But instead of lamenting, instead of using it as a trigger, stopping and asking the question, what does life want from me? Right? And in my case, apart from this general sense of change, I feel as though life wants me, A, to be patient, to develop and practice some patience as I continue on this job search. And a couple of things came along that I thought looked pretty promising and then haven't really worked out. Patience. And along with that patience, life, I feel, is asking of me faith. Still this faith thing. And the catalyst for that goes all the way back to 2020 and the pandemic and anxiety and surrender and all that stuff that I've talked about before. It continues to ask that of me now. This faith that says, look, you are going to find the place where you're meant to be, whether that's in music, whether that's in a traditional job, whether that's in some field or endeavor that I haven't even contemplated yet. You know, life is asking me to hold on to this faith that everything is going to work out and everything is going to work out in the right timing. You know, it's one thing to interview for a job and feel like you're a qualified candidate and you did a really, really good interview and then not get the job and then just fall off a cliff because you need to make a living and because you need this, in my case, maybe for your self-concept, to feel like you're not a freaking loser, like you need this on something beyond a financial level. And it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole and to fall off that cliff. And then you might find yourself in days, weeks, months of a depression, anxiety, toxicity, negative. Like it's just a bad spiral, man. But the temptation is there and it's very, very easy to do that rather than to look at it and say, I was qualified for that job, interviewed well for that job, didn't get that job. And that's a blessing. How many times have you had it happen, kids? And you know you have. When something did not come to you that you wanted or you thought you did, and that you thought seemed natural, and it did not come to you, and then you find out later that either A, that thing was a freaking nightmare and you dodged a bullet, or B, a little while after that, something even better came along. But it's very, very difficult, man. So difficult to have the faith in that happening, especially in the moment, especially when your ego kicks in, especially when your fears kick in, especially when those negative thoughts that are so practiced and so ingrained kick in, especially in my case, all right? I tend in that direction toward the negativity, toward the self-flagellation, not flatulation, flagellation. I drift so quickly in that direction, and it's like, okay, life, the universe, whatever, is demanding of me right now faith that those things that I'm not getting, I'm not meant to get, and that getting them would cause more trouble than it would help. You know, it would cause more problems than it would solve. So hard. So freaking hard to do that, especially if you're in a case where you really need the money. Having this faith in the universe, having this faith in life is so, so difficult. But the only place to develop that is in this crucible, as I've talked about, where the faith is required. It's very easy to have faith when everything's going freaking great, man. That's easy faith, all right. Harder faith, more real faith, is holding on and believing in the circumstances where you really need it, where things are not freaking good, man. And so I have life demanding of me this faith. And it's just like today with this episode right now, and this is a curious reaction to it because I think life is demanding of me to just give myself a break. Like sometimes I produce these episodes through sheer force of will, through sheer discipline, because there's some part of me that holds on to this commitment that I've made, even though there's nothing at stake here at all. And it's okay to take a week off, you know, and to give myself a break, but it's wired into me, you know, from the time I was a kid, somehow this discipline has been wired into me. And so here I sit going crazy because I don't have an episode to do. And I'm beating myself up over it. And it's like, you must meet this commitment. And that just creates this bad energy, this frustration, this guilt, like it just is a toxic freaking soup, man. And you find yourself spinning around in it when sometimes it's just okay to let it go. And so I feel in this circumstance, life is saying to me, what I demand from you is to give yourself a freaking break. Let it go. Stop beating yourself up about these perceived failures. And I do this all the time. I see a video of me playing drums live, and all that I hear and all that I see is the stuff that could have been better. I could play a song 99% flawlessly, and it's that 1% that hangs with me, and I beat myself up, and I self-flagellate, not flatulate, I self-flagellate, and that is just not a healthy or productive behavior, and it does not, in the long term, produce much. Right? You can improve yourself through sheer force of punishment and will, and you can make improvements that way, but they do not last, all right? It has to be more organic. It has to be more enthusiastic. It has to be more spiritual. In the case of my drumming, I have to improve it because I want to serve better. I have to improve it because I want to feel better about my playing, and I want to feel that I'm bringing more to the table. Not, you have to be better. This does not work in the long term. This works in the short term. It does not work in the long term. And so it is with this podcast episode that I struggled to put together. And it's funny, again, because the answer to life wanting you to give yourself a break about the podcast, you wouldn't think is producing a podcast episode. But maybe what I'm doing is allowing myself to produce an episode that might fall beneath the standard, I don't know, and being okay with that. Or maybe not producing it at all. I may not release this in the end. We'll see what happens. But it is another layer. It is another catalyst for this question of what is life demanding of you right now? I got another friend, a very close friend, in the entertainment world who was lamenting to me recently that they have begun protecting identities here, that they have recently begun working with a person who they find frustrating. Is perhaps not as professional as could be, perhaps is not as authentic and might be just a little bit kind of, how to put this gently, just a person whose ability and character and conduct just doesn't sit well. And it's a frustrating thing. And the question is, what do you do about that? And what you could do is get angry. What you could do is be a dick to that person. There's a lot of reasonable but egoic and ultimately negative ways to handle that circumstance. Better, I think, is to step back and say, well, what is life teaching you? Now, this friend of mine is on something of a spirit quest, on something of a self-improvement quest, and has made a lot of strides and has made a lot of gains and has earned some insights and made some changes and begun to elevate. And so the way to look at this maybe is to say, well, what is life demanding of me in this situation? And I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that the scenario is pulling out of this person some shadows, some stuff to be processed, all right? Is there a jealousy involved here? Is there an insecurity involved here? Am I looking at this other person that I'm working with and being threatened by that person? Or am I seeing that person achieving success in what would seem to be superficial ways? And that really bothers me because I'm not achieving the same success despite going at it, quote unquote, the right way. Like, what is it about the scenario that's triggering you? And what is life demanding of you? Is it demanding patience? Is life demanding that you have more faith in your own ability? Is life demanding that you recognize your own ability in this scenario? Is life teaching you to let go, to be less precious about things? Is life teaching you or demanding of you or asking you to just be more trustful? And can you look at this scenario? Can you look at this crucible of working with this other person as evidence of your own growth? It's like, okay, I have dealt with and contemplated and worked through some of the shallower stuff in my own psyche, in my own conduct. And now life has brought into my path this new crucible that forces out the deeper stuff. Like, am I ready for the next level of personal and spiritual development? And I don't know what the answer is for this person, but what I can say is that maybe a more useful way to look at it, instead of being angry, instead of going to other people and complaining about this person, instead of that, and my friend has not done that, my friend has done the wise thing, which is go to another friend of hers, and instead of complaining about this person, asking, what do I do about this scenario? And it says to me that my friend wants to do the productive thing with this situation. It's very easy to gossip. It's very easy to be bitter. It's very easy to be jealous and negative. It's very easy to get into the sort of manipulation that this new coworker seems to be guilty of. Instead of that, and it points to my friend's character and it points to my friend's sincerity, my friend has come to me, of all people, and said, this is a situation. What do you think? How can I handle this? And that says to me, friend, that you are growing in really powerful ways, and that you're being open and you're being vulnerable and you're being humble about this, and that you are looking for the best possible outcome for you and for the people around you. That is an enormous sign of spiritual growth, and it is an enormous sign that you're not working from ego in this scenario. And so I think the thing to do is to ask yourself, what is this scenario asking of me? Is it asking me to be compassionate towards this other person who is less experienced, hasn't been around as much, has to do some growing and some learning? Is it asking me to look at that person and recognize how far I have come? Because maybe I was that person back in the day, and I've come this far now. Is it asking you again to confront some of these shadows about faith in yourself, about faith in your ability, about owning who you are and what you do, and having the faith to know that ultimately you will reap the success that is owed to you, that you have earned, and having faith that the scenario will unfold that way? Or is it asking you to trust in the long game? Because maybe this person that you're working with is an awful human being. And that karma will unfold how it unfolds. And karma, by the way, unfolds for all of us, so let's not be superior. And is it asking you to accept timing and look at the long term? Life is asking you in this scenario so many different things, and it's a much more catalytic, it's a much more growth-inspiring way to look at it, to ask what is asked of me here. Or is life asking you to stand up for yourself in ways that you haven't before? Is life asking you to establish boundaries? Is life asking you to be a leader? Is life asking you to be compassionate? I don't know what the answer is to that. Only my friend can know the answer to that. But it's a better way of approaching it than to just be angry, or to attack that person, or to get into fights or cause drama, or undercut that person, or stab that person in the back, or gossip about that person. Much more productive, much harder to do, to look at that scenario and say, what is life asking of me? What am I intended to learn from that scenario? And maybe that sort of thing, some scenarios happening in your life, gentle listener, that you don't understand, that is painful, that is difficult, and you just want to stick your lower lip out. I'm guilty of that all the freaking time. Or you want to deflect, or you want to hide, or you want to numb yourself in whatever it is that numbs you, so as to avoid feeling whatever it is this situation is inspiring you to feel. Or you want to be negative about it, or you want to attack, or you want to go after somebody, or you want revenge. Better to ask yourself, what is life asking of me right now? What is life asking of me right now? Life is asking me to be patient. Life is asking me to have faith. Life is asking me to give myself a freaking break. Life is asking me to take things less seriously, myself included. Had I not done a podcast episode this week, absolutely nothing would be different. But I would have beat myself up so hard about not meeting this commitment, about not being disciplined enough. And it's like you cannot create through sheer force of will. Not sustainably, all right? There has to be a flow, and sometimes the flow is not there, and it's okay to give yourself a freaking break in those scenarios. And in my case, I beat myself up so hard, life is presenting me with, can you stop that? What we're asking you to do right now is to stop beating yourself up so hard. Maybe, right? And isn't that a more productive way to look at it? And it also inspires these sort of deeper questions about my own psychology. Why do I beat myself up so hard? What is that protecting me from? What is that doing for me? How is that serving me? Because it is, in some way, even a negative way, everything you do serves you in some way. That is how humanity works. So what is it? Even these negative traits, how are they serving you? What are you getting from those? And that requires you to take an honest and objective and sometimes painful look at yourself. Nobody wants to see the weaknesses in their own character. But at the same time, these are the triggers you can use to untangle yourself in some way. And having a therapist to help that is really, really, really freaking useful, all right? And that's really all I'm going to give you this week. One of the things that's likely to happen with this podcast, I'm speculating now, I'm thinking out loud, but I think the episodes are going to become shorter, especially if I do eventually land the full-time freaking gig that I'm looking for. It's like the time will not be there. And so I'm going to have to renegotiate. It's like life is asking me right now, in some ways, to do a hard reset. A hard reset on music, a hard reset on employment, a hard reset on this podcast, a hard reset on my own thinking about myself. All right. I've felt this happening for quite a while now, not just with relation to the podcast, but with life more generally. It's like I feel as though I'm being asked to renegotiate how I do things, what my priorities are, how I work. And I think one of the things that if the podcast is going to continue, it's going to need to require less of me, especially if I'm working full-time someplace. And so shorter episodes may become the norm. I know I've been saying that for a long time, and they always wind up being an hour anyways. But I think that's the direction we're heading, and so we can test that right now. So what we have here is a roughly 35-minute episode. And I'm going to cut it off there. Hopefully I've given you something worth thinking about in whatever situation you encounter. That could be a traffic situation, slow driver in front of you, or a lane reduction that means it takes 45 minutes to go 3 freaking blocks, which I've encountered recently. Anybody from L-Town will know what I'm talking about. What is life asking of you in these micro situations and in these macro situations? If your relationship is on the freaking rocks, if your job situation is kind of dire like mine is, if things are just not going your way, what is life asking of me right now? And what is the response to that? And that can open up a whole new and way more productive way of just thinking about your scenarios, thinking about the issues in your life, and how to move forward on them. I am going to move forward on this episode right now. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something from it. I know it was a bit haphazard, but we're not going to beat ourselves up over that, are we? Hope you're well. Gonna shutting up. And hey, kids, it's December. I hope you have begun to get into the holiday spirit. Hope your jingles are jangling. And hey, I'll check you later. Yeah. The very first post-episode Easter egg I did, which was on episode number 1, was I pretended to kind of lean against the wall and sigh. And I said, oh, we did it. Feels a little bit like that this week.